The modern city, with all its freeways, traffic, factories, high-rises and fast food outlets, was born not in LA, not Shanghai, not even in London, but right here in Manchester. It started out as just another cute little market town, full of alehouses, churches and lusty barmaids. But Manchester's rebirth in the 19th century as the epicentre of the Industrial Revolution brought with it all the misery and exhilaration that entails. The first half of the 19th century saw migrants pour into the city's factories and mills. The population tripled as new canals carried 80% of the world's cotton cloth. But sudden expansion led to extreme poverty and slums the like of which had never been seen before.
It wasn't all done by evil cotton barons and city chiefs. They just didn't know how to cope with it in a way. It's just gone from a very small island of community around the old cathedral to suddenly this huge expanded city with all this filth, and they didn't know what to do with it.
With no aristocracy, wealth here was generated through sheer hard graft. The Mancunian way to raise the working class was through self-help, with educational buildings like the Mechanics' Institute in neoclassical styles. Manchester was the new kid on the block. It had to show it was better than the rest. Columns and porticos decorated the Athenaeum and the art gallery, where everybody could attend lectures and concerts. To design them, Manchester took a chance with new boy Charles Barry, later to become a big cheese with the Houses of Parliament.
I think it's a birthright of Manchester to be radical. What Manchester does today, London does tomorrow. The idea of not having a class system and a hierarchy choked you once you got to a certain level. Anybody could rise in Manchester.
And anything could rise too. Manc merchants went palazzo crazy, turning warehouses and business HQs into the skyscrapers of their day. High-rise Italianate palaces to show off to buyers. This was the Florence of the Pennines, Cottonopolis. A new city, though, needs an icon to represent it. Manchester was a hive of nonconformism, leading the way in political and social reform. How best to show this off? Town Hall. There was no architectural style more suited to this dark city than Gothic. Victorians thought of Gothic as the indigenous architectural style for Northern Europe. And to the social reformers, it reeked of the kind of medievalism to which they wanted to return the industrial city. But more importantly than that, it was practical. Classicism, with all its pediments and columns, it was far too starchy and formal, whereas Gothic, with its organic shapes, could grow of any site, no matter how awkward it was. Even a leftover triangular patch of land. Finished in 1877, the town hall soared above even Manchester's skyscrapers, a symbol of the labour of the worker bee and the trade from the cotton flower. This is a cathedral to civic pride. Even the corridors are like grandiose cloisters with these shadowy columns and magnificent arches. 100 years later, though, Manchester was deep in manufacturing decline, but its pioneering spirit survived, re-emerging from beyond those dark satanic mills. Ben Kelly, young designer of the Hacienda, created the Dry Bar, taking the city's grimy industrial culture and revitalising it. This converted fabric shop became the place to drink in the 80s. Kelly kept the vast space and rawness, exposing functional metal columns and bare floorboards. It's hard to remember how radical the industrial look was when the rest of Britain was boxing in, carpeting and covering in chintz. The most impressive feature of all was this, when it opened the longest bar in Britain. See, another Manchester first, and, more importantly, more room for drinking. But industrial spaces were about to house more than just bars. Forward-thinking developers Urban Splash were to revolutionise what we consider home.
When we started, there were all these Victorian warehouses lying empty that no one lived in, nobody wanted. The property industry said they were worthless. And we said they're not worthless, they're fantastic buildings, you just need to find new uses. And I suppose we were one of the first people to start discovering that, reinventing them, filling them up with workspace, filling them up with apartments and bringing them great places to live.
Industrial loft living was countercultural. It was fantastic. But now it's become lazy, faceless, the uniform style of everywhere. So where's radical Manchester now? Its centre has been hijacked by the moneyed classes, using architecture as bling and leaving an underclass behind. The Florence of the North again, only this time it's piazzas with cappuccinos on tap.
Shut up and let me go!
But But that socially aware entrepreneurial spirit is alive and living in one of the city's most deprived areas, Ancoats. Here, urban splash is taking the lead again.
There's still this donut of deprivation, though, around the city centre. And what we're trying to do here is turn what was one of the worst estates in Manchester into one of the best places to live. And Chips is the first big building here.
You've got a mixture of classes here. It's not just for the wealthy Mancunians who made a lot of money.
Hopefully it's for everybody. There was a community here already which is actually really resilient and wanted to stay here. And they got some fantastic new homes by FAT. And what we're really trying to do is get a mix of incomes. In my personal experience of life is where you get a lot of very, very poor and deprived people living together, not a particularly nice place to live. Equally, we get very, very rich people living together in gated communities. They're not very nice places to live. We're really pushing schemes like first-time buy initiative, rent-to-home buy, create a real mixed community into Manchester.
These flats are pretty peculiar looking. I mean, they are odd looking. They're like, you know, three chips. They're bold and brassy.
The architecture is not to everybody's taste, but I don't mind that. When these great mills were built, they were bold and brassy. Most architecture through history has been bold and brassy. We like bold and brassy in Manchester.
New Islington and Chips combines panache with a sense of social inclusion. For a final example of this, I return to the Manchester Art Gallery. Festival organisers here have commissioned creative whirlwind Zaha Hadid to design a pavilion for playing Bach solo pieces. The structure is one of Zaha's few works in the UK after her thwarted attempts to build the Cardiff Opera House. It's a tempting preview of her unique style, which we'll see more of at the 2012 Olympics with her new aquatic stadium.
It was interesting to create a kind of space for music within a gallery. We've always been interested in these kind of smaller projects that have an immediacy about them. We've done this idea of the orange peel of the spiral quite a few times in other projects.
The spiral is a recurring motif in architecture, from the Samarra Mosque in Iraq through to the New York Guggenheim and the spiral towers of Japan. Its visual and proportional beauty is bound to obsess a former mathematician like Zaha.
This idea of the kind of this enclosure, spiral, a tornado in a space, and in each time it works differently, but in this case it works acoustically.
Goethe famously compared architecture to frozen music, and here you can sort of see what he means. The space seems like a few swirling notes from Bach, thrown up in the air, enveloping the audience, and freezing in space. It might look good, but how does it perform musically? Over to conductor Jason Lai.
I'm really thrilled to be here in Manchester where they've assembled this pavilion. As a former assistant conductor to the BBC Philharmonic, I was constantly frustrated at the lack of really good and interesting spaces for concerts, but I'm hoping this will be the one. Bach's solo music was paid for by rich 18th century patrons and created to be played in their intimate salons. The premise for this project was to replicate the experience for an audience of almost 200, but update the look. Team Zaha's works have been described as Baroque modernism, which fits in perfectly with a composer like Bach. Both this pavilion and his solo balance a deceptively simple, bold structure with a lightness and playfulness.
You have this kind of idea of an endless movement of the spiral and the ribbon moving around the space and transforming, modulating.
Who better to test this than Russian violinist Alina Ibragimova, who at just 23 is already the critics' darling for her unusual musical choices. She brings her honest and confident approach to Bach's solo pieces here at the Pavilion.
I've always believed that to learn to do something, you have to do it, you know, and to play Bach well, you just have to play it.
So, Elena, you've experienced the Zaha Hadid Pavilion. What do you think of the sound?
I like it a lot. I think it works well. For me, I just like the safe feeling in here. I don't know. It's a really. I feel safe here.
You feel cradled like a
yeah,
child
exactly,
in the way it wraps the sound.
The concert isn't really just about me playing a piece of Bach, you know, it's about the space surrounding, the people who come, you know, everything that happens, it's all part of it. And, you know, if there is one more person or one less person in the whole, it's already going to make a difference, I think.
A key objective of the design was to eliminate blurring of notes. This was achieved through reflective panels and a lycra-like fabric. Finally, the shape of the pavilion itself was adapted to counter echoes naturally present in the bare exhibition room. So ideally, the audience hears the same quality of performance whether they sit here, 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 and even back here. To ensure the right distribution of sound, the acoustician was there from the initial design stage right through to the final sound checks.
What we measure is essentially how the sound decays in the room, essentially how echoey it is. And for different types of music and different uses, you have optimum levels that we aim for. So for chamber music, reverberance that would have traditionally been achieved in these palatial chamber rooms, and that's the kind of decay we're after.
It all sounded so amazing, I was itching to try it out for myself.
It's very clear. I mean, it's quite responsive, but there's a certain amount of dryness. It's not exactly playing in a bathroom, but you get a feeling that the sound is coming back from all directions, which is quite nice.
As soon as I walked into the room, the acoustics changed, as if someone had placed headphones on my ears. The bright whiteness lifted mood, its purity reflecting the perceived simplicity of Bach's solo music.
To the bass, it seems quite relaxed, and it's quite clear in the higher up you go. And if you listen to that, there's actually quite a nice little echo going on.
Unfortunately, the air conditioning that keeps the gallery's treasures safe and sound can be heard in the quietest moments, and the acoustics are so sensitive they pick up every rumble of the stuff. But string instruments truly sing out, and there is a real connection between the performer and the public. It may not be the ultimate chamber music space, but it's still very special. It's a tempting glimpse of what Zaha will conjure up for the opera houses at Guangzhou and Abu Dhabi. But what about here in the UK? Manchester has paved the way. Wouldn't it be fantastic if every city had the guts to build an exciting space like this, so every child, every adult could come and hear classical music? Now that would be something to make a noise about.